A 13-year-old girl stood in a courtroom with a silver pocket watch clenched in her fist like it was the only weapon she was allowed to carry. She looked up at the bench, swallowed once, and said, "Your Honor, before you do anything else, I need to ask who you're protecting." And if you're wondering whether the room laughed, yeah, they did. But 20 minutes later, nobody was laughing, not even the judge. Drop your city in the comments, and let's keep going. Calvin Brooks had worked nights for so long that daylight felt like a rumor. For 21 years, he'd kept the Whitlock and Klein waterfront, building spotless marble floors, brass railings, glass so clear it made rich people feel immortal. At 6:10 p.m. Every evening, he kissed his daughter's forehead, checked the batteries in his flashlight, and clipped his badge onto his belt with the same quiet ritual. Then he took the bus over the river, watching Providence turn gold and then gray. Nora usually came with him for the first part. Not into the building, just to the steps outside where she'd sit with her backpack and do homework until the security guard waved her into the lobby for a few minutes of warmth. Calvin never liked that part. He didn't like his kid waiting around polished stone like she was asking permission to exist. But Nora had her own system. She'd show up with 2 pencils, a notebook, and that silver pocket watch, old, scratched, and still ticking like it had a job to do. It had been her mother's. The engraving on the back was tiny enough to miss unless you looked close. Tell it straight. Nora would press the watch to her palm, click it open, and start counting time the way other kids counted likes. She didn't love law the way TV made it look. No grand speeches, no dramatic slams of the table. Nora loved rules because rules were supposed to work the same for everyone, and in her neighborhood, they didn't. The first time she wandered into the Providence Athenaeum after school, she'd meant to find a book for English class. Instead, she found a quiet shelf labeled Civic Procedure, and she made a mistake that changed everything. She opened one book, then another, then another. 3 years later, she could read a court transcript like most kids read text messages. Not because she was trying to be special, because she was trying to be safe. On the night everything broke, Calvin's shift started like any other. He checked in with the guard at the lobby desk, an older guy named Len, who always acted like he'd served in a war nobody else remembered. "Evening, Brooks," Len said, glancing up from his crossword. "Evening," Calvin answered. "You drink water today, Len," snorted like that was a personal insult. "I'll drink coffee until my organs forgive me." Calvin smiled, rolled his cart toward the elevator, and hummed a tune. Nora said, "Sounded like a song you'd play when you were trying not to worry." Up on the private archives floor, the lights were dimmer. The carpets were thicker. The air smelled faintly like expensive paper, and somebody's cologne that never stopped announcing itself. Whitlock and Klein wasn't a law firm. It was a family office, a place old money used to stay old. Trusts, private foundations, quiet negotiations that never made the news. Calvin didn't understand most of it, and he didn't need to. His job was to keep the building running and the trash moving. That night around 1130, he heard shredders. Not the gentle office kind either. These sounded hungry. Calvin wasn't the type to snoop. He believed in minding your business the way some people believed in church. But when he came around the corner, he saw a door cracked open one of the executive suites that was usually locked tighter than a vault. Inside, a woman stood at a shredder, feeding in stacks like her life depended on it. Maris Klein, CFO, hair perfect, suit sharp. Smile, always ready. The kind of person who called everyone friend but never remembered names. She didn't see Calvin at first. Or maybe she did, and pretended she didn't. That was her real talent. Calvin hesitated. He should have backed away, should have turned his cart around and pretended the hallway needed him. But then Maris looked up, eyes meeting his for a half-second too long. And in that moment, Calvin understood something he'd spent 52 years trying to ignore. Some people didn't just want privacy. They wanted control. Maris's expression softened into something that looked friendly if you didn't know better. "Mr. Brooks," she said, voice light. "Late night." "Yes, ma'am," Calvin answered, keeping his tone respectful, neutral. "The way you spoke when you didn't want trouble to learn your name." Maris gestured vaguely at the shredder as if it were a normal hobby. "Just cleaning out old files?" Calvin nodded. He didn't ask why old files were being shredded like evidence. He turned away, pushed his cart forward, and told himself it didn't matter. But at home, Nora noticed things Calvin tried to hide. She noticed when he rubbed his thumb against his badge clip like he was trying to scrub off a feeling. "You okay?" she asked when he walked in at dawn. Calvin set his keys down carefully like the wrong sound might break something. Just tired. Nora watched him for a second longer. She didn't push. She just clicked her pocket watch closed like she was saving the question for later. The arrest came 2 days after that. It was a Thursday. Nora had a math quiz first period and a plan to ask her teacher for extra practice because she didn't like not being ready. Calvin was supposed to be asleep on the couch when she left. Instead, he was standing by the window, fully dressed, boots on, as if sleep had never been offered. "Why are you up?" Nora asked, adjusting her backpack strap. Calvin forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Building called. Said they needed me to come in early. Nora frowned. "You never go in early." Calvin shrugged like the world had asked him a simple favor. "It's fine. Go to school." He leaned down to kiss her forehead, but his hands were colder than usual. Nora waited until she heard the apartment door click shut behind him. Then she stood there in the quiet pocket watch in her palm, listening to the ticking. "Tell it straight." At 10:42 a.m., her school secretary buzzed her out of class. The hallway smelled like bleach and laminated posters. Nora walked to the office thinking she was in trouble for something tiny like talking too much in science or forgetting a form. Instead, she saw Tessa Vale standing near the counter with her arms crossed so tight they looked glued in place. Tessa cleaned the Whitlock and Klein building, too. She was union loud when it mattered, and the closest thing Nora had to an aunt. Tessa's face didn't do polite today. "Nora," she said, voice low. "Baby, don't panic. Just listen." Nora's stomach dropped like an elevator cable snapped. "Where's my dad?" Tessa swallowed, and for the first time Nora saw fear in her eyes. Real fear, not movie fear. "They took him," Tessa said. "Police came to the building. They cuffed him right there in the lobby." Nora stared like her brain refused to translate the words. For what? Tessa's jaw tightened. They're saying he stole something. Some kind of drive. Something sensitive. They're making it sound like espionage. Nora felt heat rush to her face, then drain out so fast she got dizzy. Calvin Brooks didn't even take pens from work. "He didn't," Nora said, voice small but sharp. "He didn't do it." "I know," Tessa replied, "but they set bail at 40,000. 40,000 was a number that belonged to other people's lives. Nora tried to picture it stacked in their kitchen and couldn't. "Take me to him," Nora said. Tessa's eyes softened. "Nora, honey, the holding center. Take me," Nora repeated, and this time there was no softness left. At the detention center, Calvin sat behind a thick pane of glass wearing a jumpsuit that made him look like a stranger. He tried to smile when he saw her, but his eyes were red. Not crying red, tired red. Humiliated red. Nora pressed her hand to the glass. "Tell me everything." Calvin shook his head like he wanted to protect her with silence. "You're 13. Nora clicked her pocket watch open and held it up where he could see. "I'm 13 and I've been studying court procedure since I was 10. I'm not asking for a bedtime story. I'm asking for the details that keep you alive." Calvin stared at her. For a moment, his face softened into something like pride and heartbreak mixed together. "Where did you?" he started. Later, Nora said. "Start at the beginning." So Calvin told her how Maris Klein's office had been open late, how there'd been shredding, how the next day security sent an email about restricted access and protocol violations. Then that morning in the lobby, 2 officers arrived with ADA. Grant Heller, sharp suit, confident smile, the kind of confidence that came from never being the one in handcuffs. Heller had asked Calvin about his badge, about where he'd been Tuesday night, about whether anyone had seen him near the private archives. Calvin told the truth. He'd been working. He'd been on the floor he was assigned. He'd been alone for stretches, like always. Then Heller said, calm as weather, "Your badge accessed the archives vault at 1214 a.m. and again at 109. That's where the encrypted drive was stored." Calvin had blinked, confused. "I don't even know what drive you're talking about." Heller's smile didn't change. "That's not what the logs say." And just like that, Calvin's 21 years of spotless floors turned into opportunity. Nora listened without blinking, writing everything in her notebook. Time stamps, names, the exact phrasing of Heller's questions. When Calvin finished, Nora clicked her pocket watch shut like she'd just sealed a promise. "They're counting on you being tired," she said. "They're counting on you taking a plea." Calvin's shoulders sagged. Public defender came by. Said it's safer to take a deal than fight people like them. Nora's throat tightened. She hated the word safer when it meant surrender. "What did you say?" she asked. Calvin hesitated. "I told him I'm innocent." Nora nodded once. "Good. Now we prove it." The arraignment was set for Monday morning at 9:00. That gave Nora 3 days. She didn't sleep like normal kids slept. She slept in pieces, 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there, like her body was willing to rest only if her brain stayed on watch. She went to the Athenaeum with Tessa and pulled public records like she was shopping for groceries. She wrote down who owned which building across from Whitlock and Klein, which businesses had exterior cameras. She stood at Kennedy Plaza, staring up at the waterfront building from the bus stop, clicking her pocket watch and watching the revolving door. Time tells the truth, she thought. People lie. Systems lie. But time leaves tracks. On Sunday night, Tessa brought over a stack of printouts. "I talked to Len," Tessa said. "The lobby guard?" Nora's head snapped up. "What did he say?" Tessa looked uneasy. "He said his camera feed went down that night. Only his. Only the lobby angle that would show who came in after hours." Nora's pen paused mid-air. "Convenient." Tessa nodded. "He also said Maris Klein came through around midnight with a visitor." Nora's skin prickled. Who? Tessa spread her hands, he wouldn't say. "He just said he didn't want trouble." Nora stared down at her pocket watch. The engraving felt heavy in her palm. "Tell it straight." Monday morning, the courthouse smelled like wet wool and old coffee. Nora wore a simple navy dress that had been her special occasion dress for 2 years, and it pinched at the shoulders now. She didn't care. She held her notebook under one arm and her pocket watch in the other hand like she needed both equally. Calvin walked in, guarded by 2 officers. His eyes found Nora immediately. He tried to look steady. Nora could see the effort it took. At the defense table sat his public defender, a man named Paul Leary, already flipping through papers like he'd been assigned a homework packet 5 minutes ago. On the other side was Ada Grant Heller, relaxed, confident, whispering to a woman in a cream suit, Maris Klein. Nora's stomach twisted. Maris wasn't even pretending to be uninvolved. Then the judge entered. Judge Rosalind Whitlock. Same last name as the family office. Same posture as the portraits in old buildings. Her hair was silver and perfectly set, her expression carved from reputation. Nora didn't blink. She'd seen the articles, the awards, the pictures from charity galas. Judge Whitlock tapped her gavel once, not hard. "More like a reminder I decide what matters here." "State versus Calvin Brooks," the clerk announced. Leary stood. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said, almost automatically. Heller rose, next voice smooth. "The state requests bail be increased and that the defendant be held due to risk of tampering and flight." Nora's hands clenched. Flight Calvin didn't even own a car. Heller continued. "An encrypted storage device containing confidential financial strategy was removed from a secured vault. Badge logs show the defendant accessed that vault at 2 separate times after midnight. Camera footage is unavailable due to system failure." Nora felt the room tilt. System failure. Again. Judge Whitlock leaned forward slightly. Defense Leary cleared his throat. "Your Honor, Mr. Brooks is a long-time employee. No prior record. We request reasonable bail." That was it. That was the whole defense. Nora's pulse pounded in her ears. She watched her father's face, how he kept his chin lifted even as the system tried to push it down. Judge Whitlock looked at Calvin. "Mr. Brooks, you understand the charges?" Calvin's voice came out hoarse. "Yes, ma'am. But I didn't do this." Judge Whitlock's gaze flicked to Heller, then back. "You will speak through counsel." Nora's eyes snapped to Leary. He didn't even look up. Something inside Nora went very quiet, the kind of quiet that came right before a storm. "Your Honor," Nora said, standing before she realized she was moving. The sound of her voice, small but clear, pulled heads around like magnets. Judge Whitlock's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" Nora swallowed once. "Nora Brooks. I'm his daughter." A soft ripple moved through the gallery. Not sympathy, curiosity, the kind people had when they smelled drama. Judge Whitlock's tone chilled. "Sit down." Nora didn't. "I'm asking to address the court," Nora said. 2 minutes. "That's all." Heller smirked like this was entertainment. "Your Honor, this isn't a field trip." Leary finally looked up, alarmed. "Nora, please." Calvin's eyes widened. A warning. A plea. Nora clicked her pocket watch open. The sound was tiny, but to her it felt like a gavel of her own. "Your Honor," Nora said, "there's an obvious appearance of conflict here. The complainant is Whitlock and Klein. You are Judge Whitlock." The room sharpened. People leaned in. Judge Whitlock's face didn't move, but something in her eyes tightened. "That is not for a child to argue," the judge said. Nora's voice stayed steady. "It's for anyone to notice." Heller's smile thinned. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate." Nora kept going anyway because the worst thing had already happened, her dad in a jumpsuit branded by a lie. "My father's badge logs are being treated as proof," Nora said. "But badge logs are data. Data can be altered. If the court is going to hold him based on that, then the defense needs full access to the underlying system records and the camera audit trail." Judge Whitlock leaned back slightly. "And how would you know that?" Nora's cheeks warmed, but she didn't look away. "Because I read. Because I pay attention. Because I'm not interested in convenient stories." A laugh burst from someone in the back, one sharp sound like a door slamming. Then a few more laughs followed, low and dismissive. Nora felt it like a slap, but she didn't flinch. "If you're into stories where the underdog swings back, subscribe." Judge Whitlock raised her gavel. "Enough." Bailiff escorted her back to her seat. The bailiff stepped forward, big shoulders, gentle eyes. He hesitated as if he didn't like this part of his job. Nora looked at him, then back at the judge. "I have something the court hasn't seen." Leary stood fast, flustered. "Your Honor, she doesn't." Nora reached into her notebook and pulled out a single printed page. "Len Morales," she said, reading from the top. "Lobby security guard. Statement. He says the lobby feed failed only for the hours the state claims my father accessed the vault, and only for the angle that would show who entered." Heller's posture shifted, just slightly. Judge Whitlock's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get that?" Nora's voice didn't wobble. "From Len. He signed it." Leary's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like someone realizing the test had already started. Nora took a breath. "Also, Your Honor, the badge log shows my father's badge at 1214 at the vault and at 1214 at the mechanical basement door. Same minute, same badge." A hush fell hard and heavy. Even the laughing stopped. Judge Whitlock's gaze snapped to Heller. "Is that accurate?" Heller's lips pressed together. "We can explain." Nora cut in, careful, controlled. "Badges can't be in two places at once. People can't be in two places at once. So either the data is wrong or the state is presenting it like it means something it can't mean." The bailiff froze mid-step. The gallery leaned forward, phones rising like a tide. Judge Whitlock stared at Nora for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to crush her or to listen. "Where is this page from, Judge Whitlock?" asked, voice clipped. Nora met her eyes. "From the system printout attached to the arrest report." Judge Whitlock's expression flickered, just a hairline crack in the marble. Then she tapped her gavel once harder than before. 10-minute recess," she said. "Counsel to my chambers." Heller's head snapped toward the bench like he hadn't expected that. Nora didn't exhale until the judge disappeared behind the door. Calvin turned toward her, eyes wide, with fear and pride tangled together. "Nora," he whispered, voice shaking. "What are you doing?" Nora finally let herself blink. "What you taught me," she whispered back, "not letting people tell our story for us." In the hallway, Heller approached like he owned the air. He crouched slightly to get on Nora's level, a performance of kindness. "Listen," he said softly. "You're smart. I can tell." Nora didn't answer. She just clicked her pocket watch shut. Heller continued. "There's a way to end this fast. Your dad pleads to a lesser charge. Time served. Probation. You both go home." Nora's voice came out calm. "And he carries a record for a crime he didn't commit." Heller's smile tightened. "Sometimes the system is messy. Sometimes the safest outcome, safest for who Nora asked." That question hit him harder than she expected. His eyes flashed irritation before his mask returned. "Your father is facing serious time," Heller said. "If you push, and the evidence keeps pointing his direction, you could make it worse." Nora's stomach nodded, but she didn't show it. "Then maybe the state should bring evidence that can stand up to questions." Heller's voice dropped lower. "Be careful. People can misunderstand what you're doing. They can call it interference." Nora stared at him, heart thumping. That was the first wave of pressure. Not loud, not obvious. A warning wrapped in velvet. Back inside the courtroom, the judge returned and announced bail would remain at $40,000 until the next hearing. Calvin's shoulders sagged like someone had cut a rope holding him up. Nora felt panic claw up her throat, but she swallowed it down. Stakes got crystal clear right then. If they couldn't crack the case before the preliminary hearing, Calvin would sit in a cell while the state built a story around him one motion at a time. And the longer he sat, the more guilty he looked. That afternoon, Nora and Tessa sat at the kitchen table with papers spread like a storm had hit. Tessa ran a hand over her face. "This is bigger than a drive, baby. I've seen them make people disappear with paperwork." Nora clicked the pocket watch open. "Then we use paperwork back." She circled timestamps, wrote questions, drew a timeline so tight it looked like a train track. At 1203, Len sees Maris enter with a visitor. At 1214, the badge hits the vault and the basement simultaneously. At 1226, the camera feed fails. At 109, the badge hits the vault again. At 112, Calvin clocks a maintenance check on the HVAC panel recorded in the building's own system. Nora tapped her pencil on the watch face. "You know what's weird?" she murmured. Tessa leaned in. "What my dad logs HVAC checks because he likes everything documented," Nora said. "But those logs are internal. If the state has badge logs, they probably didn't even look at the maintenance system." "Two systems. Two truths." Tessa stared at her. "You're saying there's proof he was somewhere else?" Nora nodded. "Or proof the badge was copied." They needed footage, something independent. Nora remembered the businesses across the street. The boutique hotel, the seafood place, the parking garage. She and Tessa walked it the next morning, asking questions the way adults usually ignored. At the boutique hotel, a manager shook his head. "We don't release footage without a subpoena." At the seafood place, the owner laughed. "Our camera barely catches the register. You think it catches a corporate lobby." Then Nora spotted it on the corner of a brick building across from Whitlock and Klein, a small black camera angled down toward the sidewalk. The sign above the door read, "Providence Harbor Credit Union." Inside, a woman at the front desk looked tired in a way Nora recognized. Nora didn't do cute. She did honest. "My dad got arrested," Nora said. "He didn't do it. Your camera points right at the entrance where the state says he went in." The woman blinked, startled. "How old are you?" "Old enough to be here," Nora said. "Please." The woman hesitated. Then she sighed and waved Nora closer. "We don't usually," she began, then stopped. What day? Nora's hands trembled as she said Tuesday night. "Just after midnight." The woman typed, clicked, and then froze. Nora's breath caught. On the screen, the Whitlock and Klein side entrance came into view. A figure approached, fast, purposeful. Then another. Nora leaned in until her forehead nearly touched the monitor. The first person wore a long coat hood up. The second wore a crisp suit, no hood, walking like the sidewalk belonged to him. Even blurry Nora recognized the posture. Maris Klein, and beside her, not a stranger, Judge Whitlock's nephew, Theo Whitlock, the public face of the family office, the one who shook hands at galas and made speeches about integrity. Nora's stomach flipped hard. The woman behind the desk whispered, "Oh, that's not good." Nora clicked her pocket watch, shut the sound sharp as a decision. That footage was their second turning wave. Because now it wasn't just maybe the logs are wrong. Now it was the powerful were present when they claimed they weren't. At the next hearing, the courthouse felt different. Not bigger, hungrier. Someone had posted a clip of Nora speaking at arraignment. It wasn't even the best part, just her small voice saying, "Safest for who?" It spread anyway. People loved a kid who didn't sound like a kid. And people hated the idea that a kid might be right. The gallery was packed. Heller looked annoyed, like attention belonged to him and had been misdelivered. Leary looked more awake this time, which made Nora suspicious. He kept glancing at her notebook. Judge Whitlock entered face smooth, but the tiniest tension sat at the corners of her mouth now, like she'd been reading things she didn't like. The state called its first witness Len Morales. Len stepped up, hands shaking. Nora felt a surge of affection and anger. Len was scared, and that fear had a source. Heller guided Len through questions like he was leading a toddler across a street. "You were on duty that night?" "Yes." "Did you see Mr. Brooks enter the restricted vault?" "No." "But his badge logs show access correct?" "Yes." Heller turned to the judge. "The state rests on the reliability of these access logs and the defendant's opportunity." Nora's jaw tightened. Opportunity was how they convicted people without proof. When it was Nora's turn to ask questions, Leary started to stand, then stopped when Nora rose. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Miss Brooks, you are not counsel." Nora's hands shook, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not asking to argue law, Your Honor. I'm asking to ask a witness about what he saw." Heller objected instantly. "This is turning into a spectacle." Judge Whitlock paused. The pause wasn't mercy. It was calculation. "Proceed," she said finally, briefly. Nora stepped toward Len. She didn't loom. She didn't threaten. She just held her notebook like it mattered. "Mr. Morales," Nora began softly, "you said the lobby camera feed failed." Len swallowed. "Yes." "Just yours?" Nora asked. Len hesitated. "That's what I was told." Nora clicked her pocket watch open and glanced at it like she was checking reality. "At what time did it fail?" she asked. Len shifted. "Around midnight." "Do you have a written incident report?" Nora asked. Len's eyes flicked toward Heller. "No." Nora nodded like she expected that. "Did anyone tell you not to write one?" Len's face went pale. Heller snapped. "Objection." Judge Whitlock's tone sharpened. "Answer." Len's voice came out thin. "They said it wasn't necessary." "Who said that?" Nora asked. Len's hands clenched at his sides. "Maris Klein." A whisper ran through the room like wind through dry leaves. Nora let that land, then asked the next question as gently as she could. "Did Maris Klein ever enter the building after hours that week?" Heller barked. Relevance, Nora didn't look at him. She looked at the judge. "It goes to who had access when the state claims only my father did." Judge Whitlock held Heller's gaze a beat too long. "Overruled." Len's mouth opened, closed. Then quietly he said, "Yes." Nora nodded once, pocket watch ticking in her palm. "And was she alone?" Nora asked. Len stared at the floor like it might save him. "No." Nora's heart pounded. "Who was with her?" Len's voice dropped to almost nothing. "Theo Whitlock." The courtroom didn't explode the way it did on TV. It did something worse. It went dead silent. Because now the judge's last name wasn't a coincidence. It was a wire running straight through the case. Heller stood fast, face tight. "Your Honor, this is becoming improper insinuation." Nora turned toward the judge, hands trembling but eyes steady. "Your Honor, I have video from a credit union across the street that shows Maris Klein and Theo Whitlock entering the side entrance at 1203 a.m. That is 12 minutes before the state claims my father entered the vault." Heller's head snapped toward her. "Where did you get that footage?" Nora met his eyes. By asking, that simple line hit harder than any speech. Judge Whitlock's knuckles whitened on the bench. For 1 second, Nora wondered if the judge would crush her right then, call it inadmissible, throw it out, hold her in contempt, protect her name at all costs. Instead, Judge Whitlock said, "Counsel, approach." At the bench conference, Nora couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. Heller leaned in urgent. Leary looked stunned. The judge's face was still, but her eyes were sharp. When they returned, Judge Whitlock announced a recess. And that's when the offer came. Not from Heller. From Maris Klein. Maris approached Nora in the hallway like she was approaching a small animal that might bite. "Nora," Maris said, voice sweet. "Can we talk?" Tessa stepped closer. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of me." Maris smiled at Tessa like she was furniture that had learned to talk. "Of course." Then she looked back at Nora. "You're very bright. Your father must be proud." Nora didn't answer. Maris kept going. "This is spiraling into something ugly. And it doesn't have to." Nora felt her pulse thud. "What do you mean?" Maris pulled a folder from her bag, clean crisp like she'd prepared this in a conference room. "We can resolve this," Maris said. Charges dropped. Bail released. A financial settlement for the harm caused. Tessa's eyes widened. "You're offering money." Maris's smile didn't change. "It's not money. It's accountability." Nora's stomach tightened. "What's the catch?" Maris opened the folder and slid out a single page. "Non-disclosure," she said. "No social media posts, no interviews, no accusations. Your family moves on." Nora stared at the paper. Freedom with silence. Calvin home safe eating dinner in their kitchen. And Theo Whitlock still smiling at galas, still deciding whose life mattered. Nora's throat tightened so hard it hurt. "That's not accountability," Nora said softly. "That's a purchase." Maris's eyes hardened behind her smile. "It's a practical solution. Nora clicked her pocket watch shut. No, she said. Tessa sucked in a breath like she couldn't believe Nora just did that. Maris's smile vanished. Nora, be careful. You don't understand what you're stepping into. Nora's voice came out steady even though her hands were shaking. I understand exactly what I'm stepping into. You're just not used to someone stepping back. Maris leaned in tone colder now. If you keep going, people will start asking how a 13-year-old got evidence. They'll say you broke rules. They'll say you interfered. They'll say you're being used. The second wave of pressure arrived, wearing Maris's perfume. Nora felt fear, real fear, flare in her chest. Then she thought of her dad behind glass trying to smile. Tell it straight. Nora lifted her chin. Then let them ask. Maris stared at her for a long moment like she was seeing a crack in the world she depended on. Then she turned and walked away. That night, Nora rode the bus to the detention center with Tessa, her pocket watch heavy in her coat pocket. Calvin's face lit up when he saw her, then fell when he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. Nora, he said softly. You don't have to carry this. Nora pressed her hand to the glass again. They offered to drop everything. Calvin blinked. What Nora swallowed. If we sign a paper. If we stay quiet. Calvin stared at her, and Nora saw the temptation flash across his face. Home, freedom, relief. Then she saw something else, something stronger. Disgust. They think they can buy our silence, Calvin said, voice rough. Nora nodded. I told them no. Calvin's eyes filled, and it wasn't just fear anymore. It was pride and pain. You shouldn't have to be this brave, he whispered. Nora's voice broke for the first time. I'm not brave. I'm just out of options. Calvin closed his eyes for a second like he was praying without words. Then he opened them and looked at her. If it gets too big, he said, promise me you'll protect yourself. Nora clicked her pocket watch open, stared at the ticking hands like they could answer. I promise I'll be smart, she said. I can't promise I'll be quiet. The preliminary hearing came fast. The state called an IT contractor who talked about system integrity like it was a religion. Nora listened, wrote notes, and waited. When it was their turn, Leary finally did something useful. He filed a motion to compel full access logs and an independent audit of the badge system. Heller fought it hard. Too hard. That alone told Nora where the truth lived. Then, Tessa took the stand. She wasn't polished. She didn't speak in court language. She spoke in work language, direct, practical, hard-earned. She testified that schedule assignments had been changed last minute, that Calvin had been placed on the private archives floor alone, that Maris had requested no extra staff on the night in question. Heller tried to paint Tessa as bitter, as dramatic, as confused. Tessa stared at him and said, Sir, I clean what people leave behind. I'm not confused. I'm experienced. A ripple of laughter slid through the gallery, warm this time. Nora didn't smile. Not yet. Then came the twist Nora had been quietly building toward. Leary introduced the maintenance system logs. Not glamorous. Not dramatic. Just time-stamped entries from a panel in a locked mechanical room. At 1211, Calvin's code is logged at the HVAC bay. At 1215, the same code logs a filter check. At 1218, a temperature recalibration. A human being could not be in the vault and the mechanical room at the same time. Heller's face tightened. Judge Whitlock stared at the paper like it was speaking. Nora felt her heartbeat in her throat. This was the hinge. Judge Whitlock cleared her throat. Mr. Heller, does the state dispute the authenticity of this log? Heller's voice sharpened. We would need to verify. You've had weeks, Judge Whitlock said, and the edge in her voice startled the room. Nora's breath caught. The judge was slipping. Not into kindness. Into something like self-preservation. Because now the lie was close enough to stain her too. Judge Whitlock called another recess. This time the courtroom buzzed like a hive. Outside, reporters swarmed the hallway. Nora kept her head-down pocket watch in her fist, Tessa shielding her like a wall. Then Heller's assistant approached, young, nervous eyes darting. Miss Brooks, she said quietly. He wants to speak to you. Alone. Tessa stepped forward. No. The assistant swallowed. He says it's urgent. Nora's stomach twisted. She looked up at Tessa, then at the assistant. No, alone, Nora said. You can stand right there. They walked to a quiet corner by a vending machine. Heller appeared seconds later, smile, gone. You're causing damage, he said bluntly. Nora's voice stayed calm. I'm asking questions. Heller leaned in. This case can disappear today. Your dad goes home. You go back to school. Everyone breathes. Nora's throat tightened, and Theo Whitlock stays clean. Heller's jaw clenched. Theo Whitlock is not on trial. Nora held his gaze. Neither should my dad be. Heller's voice dropped dangerous now. I'm offering you a way out. Stop making me the villain when I'm trying to be reasonable. Nora's hands trembled, but she didn't step back. Reasonable would have been investigating before arresting him. Heller's eyes flicked to Tessa, then back. You don't understand. There are donors, judges, elections, people with power. Nora's voice came out quiet, sharp. And my dad is just convenient. Heller stared at her, and something like rage flashed across his face. Then he straightened his suit jacket and said the line that changed Nora's life. If you keep digging, he said, we'll have to dig into you too. That night, Nora came home to a letter slid under their apartment door. No return address. Inside was a printout of a school attendance policy highlighted in yellow. A sticky note attached. Truancy is serious. Be careful. Nora's hands shook as she read it. The threat was childish on purpose. The message was clear. We can reach you anywhere. Tessa cursed under her breath. They're trying to scare a kid. Nora sat at the table and clicked her pocket watch open, staring at the ticking hands like they were a heartbeat she could borrow. Then she did what she always did when fear tried to make choices for her. She got specific. She mapped the timeline again, then mapped the money. Whitlock and Klein wasn't just a family office. It ran a foundation, scholarships, community grants, charity work that made headlines. Nora searched public filings late into the night, eyes burning pocket watch ticking beside her notebook, and then she saw it. A grant listed as dispersed to a small youth program, one Nora knew because she'd once tried to sign up and was told the program lost funding. But on paper, it wasn't lost. It was paid. Nora's stomach went cold. She pulled another filing, then another. A pattern formed like bruises. Money meant for community programs was being rerouted through consulting fees, administrative costs, and shell vendors with identical mailing addresses. Nora didn't have to guess anymore why Maris Klein was shredding papers. Calvin hadn't seen a drive. He'd seen a panic. The next hearing, Nora didn't start with the footage. She started with the foundation filings. Leary presented them carefully like he was afraid of how loud they were. These documents, Leary said, voice steadier than before, suggest an alternate motive for framing Mr. Brooks. Specifically that he may have witnessed internal document destruction related to foundation disbursements. Judge Whitlock's face turned unreadable. Heller objected instantly. Speculation. Character assassination. Nora stood again, heart pounding. Judge Whitlock's eyes snapped to her. Miss Brooks, the judge warned. Nora's voice came out controlled, even as fear clawed her chest. Your Honor, this is motive. It explains why an innocent man becomes a target. And it explains why people with access need a scapegoat. Judge Whitlock stared at Nora for a long moment. Then slowly she said, Mr. Heller has the state investigated these financial discrepancies. Heller's silence answered before his words did. We're here on a theft charge, he said finally. Judge Whitlock's voice sharpened. We're here on whether the state arrested the right person. The room felt like it held its breath. Then the judge did something Nora hadn't expected. She announced she was recusing herself. Not because she suddenly found integrity, because the truth was getting too close to her family name, and the only way to survive it was to step aside and pretend she'd chosen fairness all along. The case was reassigned. That change hit like a thunderclap in the building. And it came with consequences. 2 days later, Nora's school called Tessa. They said Nora's digital activity was being reviewed. They said there were concerns about how she'd obtained video footage. They said words like misuse, interference, discipline. Nora sat at the kitchen table listening on speakerphone pocket watch and her palm jaw tight. When the call ended, she stared at the wall for a long moment. Then she whispered, They're not just coming for me. They're trying to make me look like the crime. Tessa nodded, face grim. That's what they do. Flip the story until you're defending yourself instead of your father. Nora swallowed hard. Then we don't let them. Leary, finally realizing he was standing next to history, reached out to a legal clinic at Brown. A professor agreed to advise not in court as counsel but as a supervisor to ensure Nora didn't get crushed by procedural traps. And that was the contract moment that nearly broke Nora. Because the clinic offered help, but with conditions. No more solo evidence collecting. No more posting. No more public statements without review. Safety measures. Boundaries. Nora understood why. She did. But it felt like a muzzle. In the end, she agreed. Morally complicated. Necessary. Infuriating. She signed the clinic's supervision agreement with a shaking hand pocket watch beside the paper like a witness. Tell it straight, she thought. Even if you have to tell it slower. The reassigned judge was younger, less famous, less tied to old families. And that changed everything. At the next hearing, the credit union footage was admitted properly, with chain of custody documented. The badge system audit was ordered. The maintenance logs were accepted as independent proof. Heller's case began to unravel in public thread by thread. Then the audit report arrived. It stated in dry technical language that Calvin's badge had been duplicated. Someone with administrator privileges had created a ghost credential that mirrored his access profile. In other words, Calvin's badge had been used as a mask. The judge ordered Calvin released immediately. When Calvin walked out of the detention center, the air outside looked the same, but it felt different, like the world had been forced to make room for him again. Nora ran into his arms so hard, the pocket watch dug into her palm. Calvin held her tight forehead, pressed to her hair, breathing like he'd forgotten how. "You did it," he whispered. Nora's voice broke. "We did." But freedom wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the fight they couldn't walk away from anymore. Because Theo Whitlock and Maris Klein were still out there, still smiling, still hoping the system would let them keep their story. The prosecutor's office opened an internal review into Heller's handling of the case. Heller claimed he'd been misled by Whitlock and Klein. He claimed he'd trusted the data. He tried to make himself a victim of the same machine he used to crush people. Nora didn't buy it, and neither did the one person who finally mattered. The State Judicial Ethics Commission. The complaint against Judge Rosalind Whitlock wasn't about whether she'd done something illegal. It was about whether she'd used the bench to protect her family's image. And in the ethics hearing room, smaller than a courtroom, colder than a courtroom, Judge Whitlock couldn't hide behind tradition. No gavel, no gallery drama, just questions and records. Nora sat behind Calvin's pocket watch in her hand, clicking it once every time a question hit the truth. Maris Klein testified with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Theo Whitlock tried to sound outraged, like the world had offended him by noticing. Then Calvin took the seat. He didn't speak like a lawyer. He spoke like a man who'd spent his life being overlooked, until overlooking him became inconvenient. "I didn't want any of this," Calvin said, voice steady. "I wanted to go to work, do my job, come home to my kid." He looked at the panel, 3 attorneys and 1 retired judge. "But you don't get to choose what people try to do to you," Calvin continued. "You only get to choose what you do when it happens." Nora's throat tightened. The retired judge on the panel leaned forward. Her nameplate read, Chair Morgan Sloan. She had kind eyes and a voice that didn't bend. "Mr. Brooks," Chair Sloan asked, "why do you believe you were targeted?" Calvin took a breath. "Because I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Documents being destroyed. Panic in a room full of confident people." He paused. "And because they knew I didn't have money for a private attorney. They knew I'd be easy." Theo Whitlock scoffed, and it sounded like entitlement clearing its throat. Chair Sloan turned her gaze toward Theo. "Mr. Whitlock," she said calmly, "would you like to respond under oath to the evidence of your after-hours entry and the duplication of Mr. Brooks's badge?" Theo's jaw clenched. And for the first time, his confidence looked like a costume that didn't fit. He tried to dodge, tried to claim miscommunication, tried to paint Nora as a child influenced by adults. Chair Sloan listened without interrupting. Then she delivered the moral verdict, not as a speech, but as a sentence. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, "the problem here isn't a child speaking up. The problem is that it took a child to force adults to do their jobs." The room went silent. Nora felt tears sting her eyes, not because she was sad, but because someone with power had finally said the thing out loud. The Ethics Commission recommended disciplinary action for Judge Whitlock's initial involvement and referred the underlying financial irregularities to state investigators. A separate criminal investigation followed Whitlock and Klein like a shadow. Maris Klein resigned within a week, blaming health. Theo Whitlock disappeared from public events. Donors started asking questions they'd avoided for years. and Ada Grant Heller. He tried to pivot into a press conference about learning and growth. It didn't land, because Nora's pocket watch had taught her something. Time doesn't care about your excuses. On the first morning, Calvin woke up in his own bed again. Nora stood in the kitchen making eggs like it was the most normal thing in the world. Calvin watched her quietly from the doorway. She looked the same messy ponytail, bare feet concentration on her face like she was solving a math problem. But something had changed. Not her intelligence, her posture. She stood like someone who knew she had the right to take up space. Calvin cleared his throat gently. "You should be getting ready for school." Nora slid eggs onto a plate. "I am." Calvin walked in, pulled out a chair, then stopped. "Hey," he said softly. "Come here." Nora turned cautious. Calvin held out his hand. Nora hesitated, then stepped forward. Calvin pressed his palm to her cheek, thumb brushing under her eye like he was checking for bruises you couldn't see. Quote, "I'm proud of you," he said. Nora's voice came out small again, like the kid she still was. "I was scared the whole time." Calvin nodded. "Me too." They stood there a second, breathing. Then Nora clicked her pocket watch open and held it out. Calvin looked at it, puzzled. Nora swallowed. "Mom's watch. I kept clicking it because it reminded me to tell it straight." Calvin's throat worked like he was fighting emotion. He nodded once carefully. "She'd be proud of you, too." Nora blinked fast, then looked down at her plate like she was suddenly very busy being normal. A week later, Whitlock and Klein offered Calvin a settlement, a large one, enough to move to breathe, to stop counting pennies at the grocery store. But the paper came with the same condition. Silence. Calvin sat at the table with Nora and Tessa, the offer between them like a trap laid in plain sight. Calvin rubbed a hand over his face. This could make life easier. Nora's stomach tightened. She hated that it was true. Tessa spoke first. "Easy isn't always clean." Calvin looked at Nora. "What do you think?" Nora clicked her pocket watch open and stared at the ticking hands. She thought about her dad in a jumpsuit, about Len shaking on the stand, about the threat under the door. She thought about Chair Sloane's sentence, how it had cracked something open in the room. Then Nora said quietly, "If we take it, we're safe. But we're also part of the cover." Calvin nodded slowly. He pushed the settlement paper away. "We'll be okay without it," he said. "We've been okay without a lot." Nora's shoulders sagged with relief and fear all at once. "Are you sure?" Calvin looked at her with a steadiness she recognized as the same steadiness that kept him working nights year after year. "I'm sure," he said, "because I don't want you growing up thinking silence is the price of safety. Hit like if you believe truth should be louder than money." In the months that followed, Calvin took a new job, facilities supervisor at the Providence Athenaeum. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't wealthy, but it was honest, and the building felt like a home for the kind of quiet power Nora had used to save him. Nora started a legal literacy club at school, not because she thought every kid needed to argue in court, but because she'd learned something painful. People will count on you not knowing your options. She stopped promising outcomes. That was her growth. That was her accountability. When classmates asked, "Can you get my cousin out?" Nora would say, "I can help you find a lawyer. I can help you ask better questions. I can't promise more than the truth." And sometimes the truth was enough to start. One afternoon, months later, Nora and Calvin stood at Kennedy Plaza waiting for the bus. The air smelled like rain and exhaust. Nora held her pocket watch in her palm, clicking it open and shut without thinking. Calvin nudged her shoulder gently. "You still doing the time thing?" Nora shrugged. "It helps?" Calvin looked at her, expression soft. "You don't have to be on guard every second anymore." Nora stared across the street at the old waterfront building, its windows, reflecting the sky like nothing bad had ever happened inside. Then she looked up at her dad. "I know," she said, "but I also know this. If I learned it once, I can teach it." Calvin smiled. "Tell it straight." Nora's mouth curved small and real. "Always." The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. Nora slipped her hand into Calvin's as they climbed aboard. Not because she was helpless, because she chose to, and that was the part the system never understood. They weren't powerful because Nora had memorized rules. They were powerful because they refused to disappear.